Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin with the phrase that is repeated so often today: war is inevitable. It is whispered in the corridors of power, echoed in the media, and absorbed silently by citizens until it begins to feel like truth. But I ask you, is war truly inevitable, or is inevitability itself the most dangerous illusion of our time? Because history shows us one undeniable fact. Conflict is never written into destiny. It is always the result of choices, and the hook I want you to remember today is this: inevitability is not reality. It is a narrative designed to prepare you for compliance. When we are told that war is inevitable, we are not being given a statement of fact. We are being handed a narrative meant to shape how we think, how we react, and ultimately how we obey. Inevitability is the greatest illusion of power because it makes you surrender before the first shot is even fired. Think about it carefully. If war were truly destiny, if conflict was woven into the fabric of human history as unchangeable, then why have some of the bloodiest rivalries as in history transformed into partnerships? Why did France and Germany, once torn apart by endless wars, manage to build the foundations of the European Union? Why did the Cold War end not with nuclear annihilation, but with dialogue and reform? The hook is this: inevitability is never real. It is manufactured, and it is manufactured to strip you of choice. The psychology of inevitability is a weapon more powerful than any missile or tank. If people believe there is no alternative, they stop asking questions, they stop resisting, they stop imagining a different path. Leaders who lack creativity or courage lean on inevitability to justify their failures. They whispered in speeches, repeated in press conferences, and allow the media to echo it until it feels like common sense. Yet common sense is not always truth. It is often simply repetition. The hook I want you to remember is that a repetition is not reality, it is conditioning. And once you recognize conditioning, you reclaim the freedom to think. History offers us endless lessons in the dangers of surrendering to inevitability. In 1914, the alliances and military plans of Europe were said to leave no room for diplomacy, and so the continent sleepwalked into catastrophe. But alliances did not force the war, choices did. In 2003, we were told the invasion of Iraq could not be avoided because of weapons that never existed. War was sold as destiny, but in reality it was deception. Every time societies accepted inevitability, it was not because conflict was unavoidable, but because leaders manufactured a narrative to conceal their decisions. The hook is sharp: inevitability is always the mask of choice. Why does this narrative persist today? Because inevitability creates obedience. If citizens believe war cannot be prevented, they accept sacrifices without complaint. They accept higher taxes, reduced freedoms, and the destruction of prosperity as the price of destiny. Defense industries grow richer, political elites consolidate power, and foreign powers increase their influence, all while the people are told there is nothing to be done. Yet history again shows us this is false. When people refuse inevitability, when they demand accountability, when they insist that diplomacy and cooperation remain on the table, leaders are forced to adjust. The hook is simple. Inevitability collapses the moment it is challenged. This is why rejecting inevitability is itself an act of courage. It requires imagination in an era that glorifies cynicism. It demands questioning when silence is easier. But the greatest progress in human history has always been born from those who refused to believe that destruction was unavoidable. Nelson Mandela did not accept that apartheid was permanent. Mikhail Gorbachev did not accept that the Cold War must end in flames. Charles de Gaulle did not accept that France was destined to remain defeated. They all proved that inevitability is nothing more than the story told by those without vision. The hook is powerful. Every time someone rejected inevitability, history changed. And so I tell you, this war is not inevitable. It is preventable. The only inevitability in history is human choice. The question is not whether we are trapped by destiny, but whether we are willing to imagine and fight for alternatives. If inevitability is the cage, imagination is the key. Hold on to that hook and never let it go, because the moment you accept inevitability, you hand over your future. But the moment you reject it, you begin to shape history yourself. Fear has always been the most effective tool of control, and when leaders insist that war is unavoidable, they do not merely predict conflict, they instill fear to paralyze societies. Fear is not only a reaction, it is a strategy. It is the invisible weapon that can bend the will of millions without a single bullet being fired. When people are afraid, they stop asking difficult questions. They stop demanding accountability. They stop imagining alternatives. Fear shrinks horizons, it narrows vision, and it convinces you to accept sacrifices that in any other circumstance would be intolerable. The hook here is simple. Fear does not only prepare you for war, it prepares you to surrender. Consider how fear has been used in history. Before World War I, leaders spoke of being encircled, of looming threats that could not be ignored. Fear created momentum where reason might have urged caution. In the early 2000s, fear of weapons of mass destruction was enough to mobilize entire nations into war, even when the evidence was thin and the logic weak. The pattern is unmistakable. When the case for war cannot stand on reason, it is built on fear. And what is sold as security is often nothing more than insecurity weaponized against the public. The hook is sharp. Fear is not protection. It is manipulation. Fear also works because it is deeply personal. It reaches into every household, every conversation, every choice. When leaders amplify the fear of enemies abroad, they simultaneously justify restrictions at home. Freedoms are curtailed under the guise of safety. Resources are diverted from schools and hospitals to weapons and armies, all explained as a necessary shield against the enemy. And as fear grows, people begin to police themselves. They silence dissenting voices. They accept propaganda without challenge. And they conform to the idea that war is not just possible, but necessary. The brilliance of fear is that it enslaves you willingly. Yet the hook to remember is this: fear thrives only where courage is absent. One of the most devastating consequences of fear is how it dismantles solidarity. When societies are afraid, they turn against one another. Suspicion replaces trust. Minor disagreements become threats, and unity collapses under the weight of paranoia. Leaders exploit this fragmentation by presenting themselves as the only stable authority amid chaos. But in reality, it is the very cultivation of fear that has made them appear indispensable. History repeatedly teaches us that fear does not strengthen nations, it weakens them. It hollows out democracy, corrodes freedom, and prepares populations to accept conflict as the only path forward. The hook is vital. A fearful people will tolerate what a free people never would. Rejecting fear does not mean ignoring danger. It means refusing to allow danger to define the entirety of our choices. True. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act beyond it. Fear tells us to build walls, but courage builds bridges. Fear insists that diplomacy is weakness, but courage knows dialogue is strength. Fear convinces us to accept the inevitability of war, but courage imagines the possibility of peace. The difference between a fearful society and a courageous one is the difference between decline and renewal. The hook here is clear. Fear may be contagious, but so is courage. This is why we must train ourselves to recognize when fear is being manufactured, amplified, and weaponized. Ask, who benefits when fear becomes the dominant narrative? Who profits when societies are kept anxious, divided, and obedient? Fear always has beneficiaries, and they are rarely the people. The defense industries, the political elites, the power brokers of geopolitics, they rely on fear to maintain their influence. Once you identify fear as a strategy, you begin to rob it of its power. The hook to hold close is this: the antidote to fear is knowledge, awareness, and above all, imagination. War thrives when fear silences courage. But history proves that when courage silences fear, peace becomes possible. Fear is not destiny, it is a tactic. It only works when people let it rule their minds. The challenge before us is to break the cycle, to look fear in the eye, to strip it of its disguises, and to refuse its control. Because in the end, fear can only prepare us for war if we allow it. And the greatest act of defiance, the greatest act of freedom, is to live as though fear has no hold over us. Remember, the hook fear enslaves, but courage liberates. History is the greatest teacher, yet it is also the most neglected one when fear and inevitability dominate the present. Again and again, societies have been told that war was unavoidable, that the march toward conflict was dictated by forces beyond human control. And yet, every so-called inevitable war was the result of choices made by leaders. Choices that were rationalized, disguised, or hidden from the public. The tragedy is not merely the wars themselves, but how populations surrendered their agency by accepting the myth that they had no alternative. The hook is striking. History does not warn us that war is inevitable. History warns us that believing war is inevitable leads us directly into it. Consider the catastrophe of 1914. Europe's great powers believed they were caught in an iron cage of alliances, that mobilization schedules and obligations left no space for compromise. Leaders spoke as though they were helpless actors in a drama larger than themselves. The people accepted it, the press repeated it, and the result was 4 years of devastation and millions of lives lost. Yet historians now agree, war was not inevitable. At every stage, choices could have been made differently. The lesson is not that alliances forced war, but that leaders chose war and concealed those choices beneath the mask of inevitability. The hook is clear. Inevitability is the language of those unwilling to admit responsibility. The same lesson emerged a century later in 2003, when the world was told that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction created an unavoidable path to war. The media presented it as fact, leaders framed it as destiny, and populations were convinced that inaction meant catastrophe. Only later did the truth emerge there were no such weapons, and the inevitability of war had been constructed on deception. The damage, however, was already done. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, a region destabilized, and trust in leadership shattered. Once again, inevitability had been manufactured, and history's warning was ignored. The hook is sharp. When debate is silenced by inevitability, deception thrives. Look at the Cold War as another example. For decades, it was said that the clash between the West and the Soviet Union could only end in one way: nuclear annihilation. Analysts spoke of mutually assured destruction as though humanity were locked into a fate beyond its control. Yet it ended not with bombs, but with dialogue, reform, and the courage to imagine a different path. If inevitability had been accepted, the Cold War would have concluded in flames. Instead, it ended in negotiations, treaties, and new beginnings. The lesson is undeniable. Inevitability collapses when imagination takes its place. The hook is powerful. History belongs to those who dare to reject fatalism. Today, we see the same narrative being repeated in Europe. Leaders and media outlets speak constantly of confrontation with Russia as though it were already written into the future. Sacrifice is demanded, freedoms are curtailed, and fear is magnified, all justified by the myth that no alternative exists. But history tells us otherwise. There is always an alternative. Every war declared unavoidable in the past was later understood as the result of choices, miscalculations, and manipulations. To accept inevitability is to repeat the very errors history has been shouting at us to avoid. The hook is urgent when you stop questioning inevitability. You stop learning from history. What makes history such a powerful warning is not only the mistakes of the past, but the courage of those who refused inevitability. Leaders who dared to negotiate, movements that resisted fear, and citizens who demanded accountability changed the trajectory of nations. It is never the fatalists who shape history, but the visionaries who reject fatalism. The hook to remember is this: inevitability is always the excuse of the unimaginative. Possibility is always the weapon of the courageous. The point is simple yet profound. History is not a story of inevitabilities. It is a story of choices. Every war was preventable, every peace was achievable, and every inevitability was a fiction designed to limit human imagination. The real danger lies not in conflict itself, but in the willingness of societies to blind themselves to alternatives. That is what a history screams at us from the ruins of the past. And if we do not listen, then we are condemned not by destiny, but by our refusal to learn. The hook is absolute history's warning is not that war cannot be stopped, but that war begins when people stop believing it can be. Whenever we hear that war is unavoidable, we must immediately ask the most uncomfortable but necessary question: who stands to gain from such a narrative? Because behind every declaration of inevitability, there are interests, political, economic, and strategic, that benefit from convincing the public that sacrifice is their only option. War is rarely about the noble causes that are presented on the surface. It is about power, money, and influence. And the story of inevitability is crafted to disguise these motives. The hook, sharp if you want to understand inevitability, so follow the trail of profit. Look at the defense industries. Every time war is declared, inevitable budgets for weapons skyrocket. Factories produce missiles instead of machines for progress, and companies report record profits while ordinary citizens pay higher taxes and lose basic services. These corporations thrive on fear and instability. They need the perception of inevitability because it ensures a constant demand for their products. Peace is their greatest threat, not war. So ask yourself, when war is called inevitable, is it because diplomacy has failed or because industries built on war demand it? The hook here is this war feeds industries, but it starves societies. Consider also the political elites. When leaders lack solutions for domestic problems, economic decline, social unrest, political divisions, they often turn outward. They present external enemies as the source of all troubles and war as the unavoidable answer. This deflects blame from their failures and consolidates power in their hands. Citizens, fearful and uncertain, are more willing to accept restrictions, censorship, and sacrifices when convinced that national survival is at stake. War becomes not only a strategy abroad, but a strategy for control at home. The hook is striking. Inevitability is the shield behind which weak leaders hide their incompetence. Foreign powers, too, profit from inevitability. When Europe is told it must prepare for war with Russia, who benefits most? The answer is clear. Those who gain when Europe is dependent on foreign energy, foreign security guarantees, and foreign financial systems. The more Europe convinces itself that confrontation is inevitable, the more it surrenders its autonomy. The narrative of inevitability is not just a tool for war, it is a tool for dependence, and dependence is power. The hook to remember is this: every story of inevitability creates winners and losers. Make sure you know which one you are. The ordinary citizen, however, always bears the cost. It is the people who are taxed to fund wars they did not choose. It is the young who are sent to fight battles they did not start. It is families who lose their futures to inflation, shortages, and destruction. The beneficiaries of inevitability count their profits in boardrooms, while the people count their losses in cemeteries and empty bank accounts. This cruel imbalance is sustained only by convincing the public that their suffering is unavoidable. The hook is painful, but true. Inevitability is never paid for by those who preach it. It is paid for by those who believe it. History is full of such betrayals. In every so-called inevitable war, there were always elites who benefited. Arms manufacturers in World War I grew rich as millions died. Political leaders during the Cold War consolidated power by sustaining fear. Oil companies and defense contractors thrived during the wars in the Middle East. Each time, the language of inevitability was used to convince populations that their sacrifices were noble, when in reality they were serving hidden interests. The hook is essential. Inevitability is not a law of nature. It is a business model. This is why we must never accept the inevitability of war without asking who gains from it. Because when you follow the interests, the illusion begins to crumble. You see the industries that profit from destruction, the leaders who gain power from fear, and the foreign powers that benefit from dependence. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The responsibility then falls to the people to demand alternatives, to expose hidden motives, and to refuse to be sacrificed for someone else's gain. The hook to carry with you is this: the moment you ask who profits, inevitability is revealed for what it is, not destiny, but deception. True strength is not measured by the size of armies, the stockpiles of weapons, or the thunder of rhetoric. True strength lies in imagination, the ability to envision alternatives when fear insists that none exist. A society that accepts inevitability has already surrendered its greatest weapon, the power to imagine a different future. War is said to be inevitable because leaders and elites want to narrow the field of vision until there seems to be no other path. But history shows us that every major breakthrough, every moment of progress came from those who dared to imagine what others dismissed as impossible. The hook is this: imagination is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. Think of the Berlin Wall. For decades, it stood as a symbol of inevitability. Generations were told that Europe would forever be divided, that East and West were doomed to live as adversaries. Experts spoke as though the Cold War would end only in catastrophe, yet it collapsed without a shot fired. Why? Because people on both sides dared to imagine something different. They saw dialogue where others saw destruction, unity where others saw division. Imagination turned inevitability into dust. The hook here is powerful. The walls of inevitability crumble the moment imagination takes hold. Imagination requires courage because it challenges the comfortable cynicism of the status quo. It is always easier to declare that war is unavoidable than to propose bold ideas for peace. Cynicism shields leaders from responsibility. After all, if conflict is inevitable, then nothing more could have been done. Imagination, however, demands accountability. It says to leaders, why not try diplomacy? Why not build bridges? Why not invest in cooperation instead of confrontation? This is why imagination is mocked as na, because it threatens the very systems that profit from inevitability. The hook to hold on to is this: they call imagination na only because they fear its power. Every leader who shaped history understood this truth. Charles de Gaulle refused to accept that France would remain humiliated after World War II. He imagined a nation reborn. Nelson Mandela did not accept that apartheid was permanent. He imagined a South Africa united. Mikhail Gorbachev rejected the belief that the Cold War could end only in flames. He imagined dialogue that reshaped the global order. These were not weak men. They were among the strongest of their time precisely because they dared to imagine what others feared to consider. Their strength did not come from weapons, it came from vision. The hook is striking: the strongest leaders are not those who escalate conflict, but those who expand possibility. Imagination is also contagious. When one person envisions a better future, others begin to see it too. A society trained to think in terms of inevitability suddenly discovers that alternatives exist. This is how movements grow, how peace becomes possible, and how history changes. Cynicism paralyzes, but imagination mobilizes its people. And hope is the energy that transforms the impossible into the inevitable. The hook is inspiring. Inevitability belongs to cynics, but history belongs to dreamers. This is why societies must protect imagination, especially in times of crisis. Media that repeats only fear kills imagination. Leaders who speak only of sacrifice strangle imagination. Institutions that frame war as the sole option extinguish imagination. But when imagination survives, it becomes the seed of transformation. It is imagination that insists diplomacy is still possible, cooperation is still valuable, and peace is still within reach. And once that seed takes root, no amount of fear can uproot it. The hook is clear: imagination is the antidote to inevitability. Strength, then, is not about surrendering to the so-called logic of war, but about daring to imagine the logic of peace. It is not about obeying inevitability, but about creating alternatives. A society that invests in imagination invests in resilience, creativity, and hope. And these are the true foundations of strength. Remember this: the world is changed not by those who accept inevitability, but by those who defy it with imagination. The hook to carry forward is simple yet transformative. The strongest force in history is not the inevitability of war, but the imagination of peace. The future is not written in the stars, nor is it dictated by fate. It is carved by the choices we make. When leaders declare that war is inevitable, they are not describing destiny, they are making a choice and disguising it as fate. This deception robs societies of agency, making people believe they are powerless spectators in a drama already determined. Yet history proves time and again that the future bends to human decisions. The hook is this war becomes inevitable only when people stop believing they have a choice. Think of the countless times humanity has stood at the edge of catastrophe. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world was told it was on the brink of nuclear war. Many believed there was no turning back, that escalation was guaranteed, yet choices made in those tense days prevented destruction. Restraint, dialogue, and the courage to step back from the abyss shaped the outcome. What could have been remembered as inevitable devastation is now remembered as one of history's narrow escapes. The hook here is sharp. Fate did not save the world, choices did. Look also at the fall of the Berlin Wall. For decades, experts argued that the Cold War division of Europe was permanent. The future seemed sealed, but choices made by courageous leaders and ordinary citizens changed everything. Peaceful demonstrations, reformist policies, and the refusal to accept permanent division rewrote the future. What had been framed as an unchangeable reality became a fleeting memory. This teaches us that inevitability is the language of those who lack imagination, while choice is the language of those who make history. The hook is powerful. The future always belongs to those who act, not those who resign. When societies accept fate as unchangeable, they become passive. They allow elites to dictate the course of history, and in doing so, they surrender their greatest strength, the ability to shape outcomes. This passivity is exactly what the narrative of inevitability is designed to create. It transforms free citizens into obedient subjects, willing to endure sacrifices because they believe nothing else is possible. But when people realize that the future is not fate but choice, they reclaim power. They demand alternatives, they insist on dialogue, and they resist manipulation. The hook is clear: a passive society follows destiny, but an active society creates it. Every generation is confronted with this question: will we accept the future as something imposed upon us, or will we shape it with our own decisions? Those who argue for inevitability prefer obedience because it secures their power. But those who embrace choice recognize that history is open, fluid, and full of possibilities. War is not the natural end of political tension. War is a choice made by leaders who either lack imagination or who profit from destruction. Peace, too, is a choice, one that requires courage, creativity, and vision. The hook to remember is this: fate excuses failure, but choice demands responsibility. The greatest danger lies in forgetting this simple truth. If people surrender their belief in choice, they become complicit in the very outcomes they fear. Wars are then not only fought by armies, but enabled by silent acceptance. Yet the reverse is also true. When people embrace choice, they can halt the march to war, open new paths for diplomacy, and build futures that others thought impossible. The future is never a fixed road. It is a landscape shaped by every decision we make along the way. The hook is inspiring. The road to peace is not discovered. It is chosen. So let us strip inevitability of its disguise and see it for what it really is: a narrative designed to control. The future belongs to those who refuse to surrender to fatalism, who reject the comfort of resignation, and who act with the knowledge that every decision matters. War is not a fate that descends from the heavens. It is a choice made on earth. And the most empowering truth we can hold on to is this: the only inevitability in history is that human choices will decide what comes next. The hook to carry with you is eternal fate is a myth. Choice is reality.